We're going to begin covering the Ricardian model, which is covered in Chapter 2. We'll do it in two parts. The first part will set up the model, and then next time we'll work on how we solve the model for the solutions to international trade equilibrium. So basically, we'll be dealing with the reasons for trade, the Ricardian model itself in this video, and then 3 and 4 will come in another video. Now I'm going to be going fairly quickly through the slides, and that's because my lecture notes cover the same material and explain the material, so I don't need to do a 100% rehash of what I have in my notes. And my notes have diagrams and comments and so forth. So really, this is a complement to the notes, but the notes that are online in PDF really are covering the same ideas. So countries trade goods for a couple of different reasons. Technology differences. Technology is a form of resource, and different countries have invested in learning how to do different things. So there's potential benefit from trade there. Of course, as everyone understands, differences in resources matter, and the traditional classification is labor, capital, and land. Now, labor can mean quality of labor or skill of labor specifically, as well as the amount of labor. Differences in the cost of offshoring, which is basically that countries work in trade networks, and because of the way the network is set up, it may be that one country has an advantage because of its location in doing certain parts of the supply chain. And proximity. That's not something that you immediately think about. It is a strong finding that everything else equal, countries that are physically close to each other trade a lot more than you would expect, allowing for all the other factors, including transportation costs. The proximity force is stronger than can be explained by simple transport costs. So the Ricardian model is really focusing on technology differences, and that's the origin of the concept of comparative advantage, and that was the idea of Ricardo when he first formulated this idea. Now we have to be very careful when we say technology differences. Technology differences really mean that there is a difference in the trade-off when you move from producing one good to the next, or as we'll see in a visual sense, the opportunity cost as shown by the slope of an indifference curve is different in different countries, and you should understand about indifference curves at this point, I will assume. Now, Ricardo was the first person to realize that absolute advantage in the production of goods does not explain trade. Now, by absolute advantage, we kind of mean the country that can produce a good at lowest absolute cost in terms of dollars per unit. And that is the intuition that people will have, but it does not explain trade patterns. Trade patterns are explained by comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is reflected in the trade-off between producing units of one kind of good versus a different kind of good. And that's quite different from the concept of absolute advantage. It's always easiest to explain a model by visual means, by a diagram or a simple case. And the original Ricardian case is still as useful as it was 200 years ago. So in Ricardo's original model of trade, he used two goods and two countries. And the two countries were England and Portugal, and wine and wool. Now, we update that example a little bit. The two goods are wheat and cloth, and the two countries are the US and Europe. Now, forget about land and capital and all the things that could complicate the story of production. To make it simple, we'll assume that the only factor of production is labor. So in the home country, one worker can produce 4 bushels of wheat, and that means the marginal product of labor is 4 when applied to wheat. So MPL subscript W means wheat. The alternative for one worker is to produce 2 yards of cloth. So their marginal product of labor producing cloth, subscript C, is equal to 2. So the trade-off for a worker is they can produce 4 units of wheat or 2 units of cloth. And that's for the home country. So without even going to the foreign country yet, we know that for this model to be interesting, those two MPLs, the MPLW and the MPLC, will have to have a different ratio for the foreign country. If the ratio of MPL subscript W and MPL subscript C, if that ratio was the same, there'd be no point in these two countries, the home and foreign, trading with each other. So that means we can graph the home country's production possibilities frontier, given we have the information about the marginal products of wheat and cloth. And by the way, that ratio stays the same. So that means that the production possibility frontier has to be a straight line. It has to be straight. It cannot be a curvy line. If it was a curvy line, the relative or ratio of the two marginal products would be changing over the course of the diagram. And the slope of the PPF at any point is the opportunity cost of wheat. That is to say, the amount of cloth you have to give up to get another unit of wheat. If we know the number of workers in the country, of course, we can figure out the maximum amount of each kind of good that can be produced. So to keep it simple, suppose home has 25 workers. If all they did was produce wheat, they produced 100 bushels. With 25 workers, if all they produced was cloth, that would give you 50 yards of cloth. So here's the diagram with the information for the home country. Very simple. We put cloth on the vertical, we put wheat on the horizontal. If you put all of your workers into producing cloth, they can produce the maximum amount of cloth, which is 50. If you put all of your workers into producing wheat, you can produce 100 bushels of wheat. Now, at any point along that production possibility frontier, you have a constant ratio between the two marginal productivities of labor, the amount of labor devoted for cloth and wheat. So if you want to move from a certain amount of wheat to more cloth, that's generating a cost to you of having more cloth in terms of the wheat you're giving up, and vice versa. So this is like really simple microeconomics. Now we go a little bit beyond principles of economics and we talk about indifference curves. And you know that an indifference curve is really representation of the preferences side of the model. And an indifference curve represents all the combinations of wheat and cloth between which you are indifferent, given you have a certain level of welfare. So it's curved and it is telling you the combinations that people regard as being of equal certain amount of welfare. And when building the model, in order to figure out what's the optimum thing for a country to do, you have to have some information about preferences, right? If nobody ever wanted cloth and all people wanted to do was eat wheat, that would give you one result. If they wanted only cloth and no one wanted to eat wheat, that would give you a different result for the desirable equilibrium. Or if there's going to be some of both wheat and cloth, there's an infinite number of options available to you. So you have to have the information about preferences, and that's what an indifference curve is bringing into the model. The good news is the production side is simple. This is building model stuff. You want the model to be as simple as possible, but not too simple. So what you're seeing here is that the production side of the model is very simple. The preferences side is a little bit more complicated because it's using the indifference curves. So now we put the indifference curves and the production function together on the same diagram. Now, the production function is a single line because you have fixed numbers of workers and they're always fully employed. So your options are completely described by a straight line. Indifference curves, the whole range of indifference curves are telling you about people's preferences given their infinite different levels of welfare. So that's why we have multiple curve indifference curves. And you see in the diagram here, if you are on indifference curve D, you would be doing worse than you could be doing because you can be on indifference curve B, and that's a feasible option. That's an option that's open to you, but it's only open to you as long as you are producing at point A. You've got to be producing at point A in order to reach the highest possible indifference curve, B. And you'd love to be at C, but the production function doesn't let you get there. And you should recall from your microeconomics that the point of contact, the point of tangency between the indifference curve and the production function is not only representing the trade-off in production and the level of your welfare, it also in equilibrium reflects in trade the relative price of wheat and cloth. The price in the market has to equal that slope for everything to work. So another way to express it is by finding the point of tangency between the indifference curve and the production function, we also find the necessary price ratio which will, as they say, support that equilibrium solution. And that gets us to another hidden assumption in this sort of model, and that is that the prices and relative prices are perfectly flexible. So prices are free to move to where they need to be. So under the surface, again, this is a little bit of model building. In this model, there's no such thing as a monopoly or an oligopoly. No employer has any sort of market power, and there's no union or a sort of negotiating body for workers. It's very atomistic, competitive market on both sides, on the product side and also on the supply of labor side. So in equilibrium, the price of wheat multiplied by the marginal product of wheat has got to be equal to the price of cloth times the marginal product of cloth. So PW over PC in equilibrium equals MPLC divided by MPLW. The good news about dealing with the foreign country is that the numbers are different, but otherwise the entire logic, the entire theory is exactly the same. It's the mirror image of the home country. we'll assume 100 workers available in the foreign country. So the foreign country has a bigger population, if you like. But the marginal productivity of labor is different in the foreign country. Here is the foreign country's production possibility frontier. It's a slope of 1 to 1. So this slope is steeper than for the home country. But otherwise, the logic works exactly the same. In this model, the foreign country has the comparative advantage in the good that's on the left-hand side vertical axis, and the home country has the comparative advantage in what I'll call the horizontal axis, good. By looking at the chart, you can see the foreign country has a comparative advantage in producing cloth, and the home has the comparative advantage in producing wheat. By the way, in my lecture notes, on page 10 of my lecture notes, I realized that when I drew the diagram for the two countries, for some reason my lecture notes have the wheat and cloth axes flipped. So in my lecture note on page 10, I don't know why I did this, on my page 10 of my lecture notes, I have wheat on the vertical. So don't get confused because I did that. I don't know why I did that. So when I talk about the vertical axis country, the country who has the steeper slope when we're dealing with the notes here on the screen, it's cloth that's on the vertical axis. But on page 10 of my notes, for some reason, I put cloth on the horizontal axis. Okay, to continue. So the foreign country, I'm not going to repeat everything. The foreign country has the same pattern as the domestic country. It just has different intercept values because its workers have different levels of productivity on the two goods. So again, the equilibrium is at the point of tangency between the indifference curve and the production possibility frontier, and all the same sort of conditions apply as for the home country. So if you work it all out, in equilibrium, the relative price of cloth in the foreign country in equilibrium is equal to 1. The relative price of cloth in the home country in equilibrium, domestic equilibrium, is 2. Now at this point, we have not opened up to trade. The two countries have been in autarky, totally self-sufficient. And that's why there's no reason the two price ratios should be equilibrated. There's no trade between the countries, and there's certainly no movement of workers between countries either. So if we now open up to trade, we allow trade between the two countries, immediately the home country can make money by exporting wheat to the domestic country. When you've opened up to trade between the two countries, now it's like you only have one big market, and you have one side of the market that will want to export cloth, and the other side of the market, the other country, will want to export wheat. Once we open up to trade, producers of both kinds of goods are going to want to start exporting. Consider a cloth producer in the foreign country. Look at that first inequality, the PC divided by PW equals 1. PC divided by PW equals 1 in the foreign country means that if I'm a cloth producer, I will receive 1 unit of wheat for every unit of cloth that I sell. Got that? In the foreign country, I'm a cloth producer. Every 1 unit of cloth I produce gets me 1 unit of wheat. That's what PC divided by PW equals 1 means. But in the home country, 1 unit of cloth gets me 2 units of wheat. I'm a cloth producer in the foreign country. I'm looking over at the home country, and my 1 unit of cloth will return to me, in effect, 2 units of wheat. So I'm going to start selling my cloth to the home country. And then in the home country, for wheat producers, the logic works in a similar way. In the home country, if I produce wheat, I only receive half a unit of cloth for every unit of wheat that I sell. But if I take my wheat and sell it in the foreign country, I'll get 1 unit of cloth. I'll get double if I start exporting my wheat from the home country to the foreign country. So starting from this initial situation, after you've opened up to trade and no trade between countries has happened yet, home will start exporting wheat and foreign will start exporting cloth. Each country begins to export the good in which it has the comparative advantage. And here's sort of the most important point. It's ratios that determine what happens. When we did this little kind of explanation, we were always looking at ratios, not absolute costs of production. It's the trade-off between the two goods that matters for trade. And it doesn't matter which country is the lowest cost producer of cloth in absolute terms. It's comparison of the ratios of cost for each of the two goods. And we really hit this point because the natural intuition when people think about international trade is to imagine that the lowest absolute cost producer exports this or that. But it's relative costs that matter, not absolute costs. This is really counterintuitive, absolutely counterintuitive. All our natural intuition tells us that the lowest cost producer in absolute terms is the exporter, but that's not actually the case. This is the last slide, and this is the end slide for this round. So where we've ended up is that there are two countries who have opened to trade with each other. They will reach an international trade equilibrium when prices align according to what's happening in international trade. But to fully understand what the sort of final trade equilibrium will be like, we're going to have to do some more graphing and comparisons of lines and curves and so forth. And we're not going to do that this round. We'll save that for part 2 next time. And that's it for this session.